Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 28. The text opens up with this. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom. We got to understand here that at the end of chapter 5, Belshazzar, who was the king, he was the co-regent with his father, Nabonidus. These guys were king together, which is why, again, Belshazzar offered Daniel the third place in the kingdom anyways. Belshazzar ends with his head getting chopped off. Nabonidus gets thrown into exile, and Darius, often referred to in the book of Daniel as Darius, but and other books, but in history we know him as Cyrus the Great. He was the first king of the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. Darius is now the guy in charge. So if you're in Babylon, there was a huge regime change. The king is now gone. There is an entirely new kingdom on the throne, and the guy who's ruling the whole thing, his name is Cyrus, again in the book of Daniel, Darius. So Darius is the new king, and he's part of a new nation. And he appoints 120 satraps to rule throughout the whole kingdom. They get the whole Babylonian Empire and then some, with 3 administrators over them. So there's 3 over the 120 satraps. I'm forgetting the number of specific satrapies that were put together. It ends up being that there are like 3 to 4 satraps for each satrapy. And so it's like kind of 40 or so, 30 to 40 counties with that throughout the kingdom. And he has these 120 guys who oversee those counties, those satrapies. And over those 120 are 3 administrators, one of whom was Daniel. So Daniel had so distinguished himself at the beginning of the regime change that Cyrus the Great, he's not worried that Daniel used to serve the Babylonians. He's like, this guy knows what's going on. I want to use him. Daniel seems like he knows what to do. And so Daniel works for Cyrus the Great. Now, it's important to remember that if Daniel went into Babylon at 15 years old, and he had spent, I think the number is, forgive me here, I want to say it's 62 or 63 years in Babylon, then this guy is, 76. He's 77 years old at this point. He is an old man. And yet it would seem that his mind is still sharp, that he is still able to work, able to do well, and to do a very good job. So the satraps remain accountable to them, that's these 3 administrators, so that the king might not suffer loss. Their job is to keep the kingdom efficient, make sure the tax money goes to where it's supposed to be. Now Daniel is so distinguished. Okay, so let me go back to the guide here, verses 1 through 2. And what we could say here is that we have a new king who appoints Daniel to a high position. It's kind of how the story starts. Now Daniel so extinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So if we go back, now verse 3, Daniel's success leads to promotion. And if we're looking specifically at the promotion in view here, sorry, I'm going to rearrange things. Okay. If we're looking at particularly the promotion in view here, wrong way, that he will be over the whole kingdom, meaning he will be over these administrators as well. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. The satraps, there are 120. So some of the satraps, along with the other 2 administrators, are trying to say, we don't want Daniel in charge. Let's go find some dirt. Let's find some dirt in his government affairs, right? So if we're continuing on here, verse 4, they look for dirt on Daniel's professional work. And what's great is they're not able to find any. They were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We'll never find any basis for the charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So, verse 5. Unable to find dirt, they attack his faith. And I just want to point out right here that this is, for us, we might say it's unfair, that's not cool, that's not nice, but this is actually a good thing. If all the world can do is come at your faith because your conduct is right, you're doing really well. That is exactly how the exile is supposed to live. So, these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king, and they said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors, everybody is involved, have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den." Now, remember the context of this story? The reason that this makes sense is because Darius is the new king. And so for 30 days, right, everybody has to basically pledge their allegiance to the new king. He's the only person who's supposed to be prayed for. You see, the Persians allowed the people that they oversaw to go worship their own gods. In fact, you'll see later in Darius's life, he will send the exiles home. He'll send everybody back home. He'll say, "Go back to where you're from. Here's money. Build your temples, worship your gods, and pray to your own gods for my sake." But for at least these 30 days, he wants everybody to worship himself. And that's, again, it's like a show of allegiance. So we'll keep going. "Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writings so it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So there's a Persian Mede law that says if you write it into law, you can't repeal your law. So Darius put the decree in writing. Darius thinks this is a great idea. So if we're going back, verses 6 through 9, we'll just call them bad guys. How about that? The bad guys lay a trap for Daniel using the king's need for loyalty. Now, that is just my guess. Using the king's need for loyalty. We don't know that's exactly why the king would go with this. It seems to kind of go against his performance in other areas, but I definitely think that that's the reason why, at least to me. Now, when Daniel learned the decree had been published, he went home to his room upstairs where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knee and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. So I really should have moved this dot kind of up more to this location because we're right at the apex. The first kind of plot question that would show up right here, the question that we would ask ourselves is, what will Daniel do? Is he only going to pray to King Darius, King Cyrus for the next 30 days? The trap has been laid. This is the height of tension. And right in the height of tension, we kind of learned the main points of a lesson. And so what Daniel does for these moments really shows and teaches us a lot about exile life. And what he did was do exactly what he had done before. He got down on his hands and knees, giving thanks, and prayed, with windows open toward Jerusalem. So, verse 10, Daniel stays faithful to God. he does not decide to stop praying, and he does not decide to close the window. He decides to pray with the window open to God. And we would have to ask ourselves why, right? Like why would you not just close the window, right? You don't have to keep the window open. You could close the window and keep praying, right? And these men know that he's going to keep the window open. They went as a group and found Daniel praying, asking God for help. Not only do they know that Daniel's praying, they know what he's praying about. Daniel's like, Lord God, they've just told me I can't do what I'm doing right now with this window open. Please help me. And so they go to the king. So verse 10 right here, right? He gets down on his knees, he prays, he gives thanks to God just as he had done before with the windows open. I think, and if we look at like a chapter like in the New Testament, Romans, oh gosh, now I'm forgetting if it's chapter 13 or 14. But in Paul's discussion on meat sacrificed to idols, he tells the people that anything that does not proceed from faith, is sin, right? And if Daniel has been doing this every day for many, many years, if he were to close that window, that would not be an act of faith. That would be an act of fear. And that's not okay for the Christian to live out of fear. We're supposed to live by faith. This is also true for the exile. And so knowing this, he prays in faith to God. And the proof of that faith is that he doesn't close the window. Now, I want to make it clear here. This doesn't mean that this is the only right way for exiles to live out their faith. We don't always have to be this open about our faith, especially in places where we're going to be persecuted for our faith. But for Daniel, in this particular circumstance, it would be wrong for him to close the window. It would be an act of fear, not an act of faith. And I think that has so much to do with this is how he had been doing it for so many years, right? So anyways, that's the lesson we learn here at the top is faith, not fear, is the only appropriate motivation. We've got to live by faith. And so that's why he does what he does. And then what happens? Verse 11, he gets caught. And then, verse 12, they go to the king. They spoke to him about the whole decree. Did you not publish this whole decree? The king answered, the decree stands, which cannot be repealed. And then verse 13, the trap swings shut. He pays no attention to you or the decree you're writing. He still prays 3 times a day. So going back over here, Daniel gets caught, verses 12 through 13. The trap slams shut. And the king realizes what's been going on. The king hears this. He is greatly distressed and determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. And I love it. So this is maybe the end of the first story or the beginning of the next story. But verse 14 shows us, once again, a powerless king. If the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story showed us that the king is powerless to kill someone that God wants to save, this story shows us that when the king is powerless to save, God can still save. So it's kind of like both sides of this story. It's pretty cool. So anyways, So going back to the story, the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember your majesty that according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order. They brought Daniel, threw him into the lion's den, and the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. Right? Because I can't do it. I'm not strong enough. So may your God that you continually serve rescue you. And so how does this begin? Verses 15 through 16. The pagan king hopes in Daniel's God. we were look at the Cyrus, we know from his history, he has no problem accepting or believing in other people's gods. It doesn't mean that he really follows Yahweh ever, but he's just going to pray to Daniel's God on Daniel's behalf here, right? May your God save you. Verse 17, stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and with the nobles and Daniel's situation. Oh, sorry, and I missed another key detail here. And Daniel goes into the den. And then verse 17, the stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. And if that doesn't remind you of Jesus in a tomb, in a sealed tomb, I don't know what will. The parallels here, the foreshadowing is so beautiful. 18, then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating or any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. Verse 17. Verse 17, the tomb is sealed. And then we'll just go, and verse 18, the king is distraught. Okay, so the king has tried to help. He can't. Daniel is now in the tomb, and the king can't sleep that night. At the first light of dawn, the king gets up and hurries to the lion's den. Again, this just feels so much like Jesus at the resurrection. 20, when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Now we're getting really close to the peak of the action here. The king returns and wonders, can God save? Can God save? When the king's not strong enough to save, can Daniel's God still save? And verse 20, Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty. So Daniel's statement here is incredibly bold. The first part is, that he's been delivered, that the lions have not hurt him because God shut their mouths. But he says more than this. He says because. He's grounding his deliverance in this. I was innocent in my God's sight. Nor, that means, and in addition to that, I have never done any wrong before you, your majesty. Not only is he saying I'm innocent in God's sight, I'm also innocent in your sight. Now, that's an incredible thing to say when we consider that Daniel had certainly disobeyed the law of the Medes and the Persians. And yet he is still able to say that I've done nothing wrong before you, your majesty. So what he's saying is that law that was passed wasn't a legitimate law because my God is somebody that I must pray to. I cannot pray to you. I cannot pray to your gods. It would be wrong for me to do so. And when he obeys God rather than men, he is able to say back to the king, I've done nothing wrong before you. Which would be to recognize that even though I violated this law of the Medes and the Persians, I'm still innocent. I think what that means is this is not a valid law. Now, if he disobeyed it with rebellion and anger in his heart, I think that would be wrong. But he disobeyed it, as we saw already, in faithfulness to God. Not out of fear and not out of rebellion, but in faithfulness to God. And so he can say, because I'm trying to serve God and I'm genuinely trying to serve you. I don't want to disobey you. I'm trying to serve you, my king, but I have to be faithful to my God. I have done nothing wrong before you. And so what's really incredible in this, in verses 20 through 22, is that we have a couple themes. Innocence, God's deliverance, and lessons on law, obedience, for the exile. Really, really important here, because one of those things that we're going to have to struggle with as exiles is, do we or don't we obey the laws that we've been given? And if we disobey the laws that we've been given, can we go back to the people that we've disobeyed, like Darius, and say, I've done nothing wrong. I'm still innocent. And say that faithfully and truthfully and honestly. It's hard to have that sort of boldness, but obviously here the truthfulness of the statement speaks for itself in Daniel's deliverance. We have to just make sure that our hearts are being faithful if we ever do have to disobey our governments. The king was overjoyed, gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. He's lifted. There's no wound on him because he had trusted God. So now there's a second reason here. And I forgot to add that. Verses 22 and 23. The last theme here is trust, which is another way of talking about faith. So Daniel is faithful to God because he is faithful in, or he has faith in God. He is faithful to God because he trusts God. And at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Just in case you thought maybe the lions weren't hungry, they give you those pretty gruesome details here. So verse 24, the bad guys are killed. We'll continue. Verse 25. May he has this proclamation now for everyone. May you greatly prosper. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, and he will never end. He talks about God's eternality. He talks about God's life. He talks about God's dominion and that it will never end. He rescues and saves. So God is a God of deliver. He performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. And then he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions, which comes back to this rescues and saves. And inside of the rescues and saves, this is a kind of an A, B, A sort of situation, a bit of a sandwich here. But this is the word of praise that Darius has for the God of Israel at the end of the day. So verses 25 through 27, Darius praises God. And then finally, verse 28. Let's go back real fast. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. This "and" might be translated better as an even. So it'd be like the reign of Darius, even the reign of Cyrus the Persian. If that is the case, which it most likely is, then Darius and Cyrus are the same person, which would make the most sense. Really, I think that it's a very reasonable translation of the text, and it makes sense of the text historically. So all that is going on, and let's go back to our plot line. And so Daniel prospers under new king and new enemies. Daniel is, as we said, probably in his 70s now. So I don't know how much longer he'll serve under Cyrus. It won't be too much longer for sure. He'll be getting old soon. I mean, he already is old. But we just see that even in Daniel's 70s, the work is not yet over. There is still much faithfulness and work to be done. And it's just a story for the exile here from Nebuchadnezzar to Cyrus, from the Babylonians to the Persians. The exiles are in Babylon, and they're not there by accident. They have been sent by God. God is with them every step of the way. And whether it's a king who thinks he can kill whoever he wants, or a king who thinks I can't save anybody, God continues to show that he is greater than earthly kings, and the exiles should trust in him. So because God is unchangingly faithful, God is unchangingly faithful. So let us be faithful to him. and trust that he will deliver. In the New Testament, we remember that although Jesus promises that, hey, actually the lions are going to get you. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to be flogged. You're going to be beaten. You're going to be mocked. You're going to die in my name. And yet, you still will be saved. Nothing can separate us from the love of God, because the real enemy, which isn't Cyrus or Nebuchadnezzar, the real enemy, which is sin and death, have been defeated at the cross. We are utterly and eternally saved. God is unchangingly faithful, so let us be faithful to him.